Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Understanding Tariff Impacts on Utility Program Cost Effectiveness. We're happy to have you here. Thank you for joining. Before we get started, I'll go over a few housekeeping items here. If you're having trouble hearing me, well, there's other options to listen to. You can do a call-in. Usually the computer audio is the best, but there is a call-in function, and you can get there by clicking on the caret at the top of your menu. Uh, there will be a live question and answer period at the end of today's session. So as we go along, if you have questions, put them into that question dialog box, and we'll get to them at the end. And today's presentation is being recorded, and you will all be sent the recording of this presentation. And continuing education credit will be offered today for those folks who are interested. Just indicate you would like to receive a certificate for your self-reporting in the post-webinar survey. Also, a copy of this deck can be provided upon request, and that you put that request in the post-webinar survey. All right. So I'm going to hand it over to our speakers today, Rebecca Troutfetter and Dan Cote. Rebecca, floor is yours.
Great. Thanks, Nick. Hi, all. I am Rebecca Troutfetter. I am part of our engineering team here at CLEAResult, and I am really excited to give you all a rapid-fire crash course on Cost Effectiveness 101 and where some of these tariffs, well, if, how, when some tariffs might impact those cost tests. So Dan, I'll hand it over to you to introduce and get us going.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. I'm Dan Cote. I'm the director of our channel delivery team here at CLEAResult. We're a centralized operations team that has visibility into a lot of the ways tariffs are impacting the market and what we're seeing in some of our programs. So while Rebecca will be going over the cost effectiveness testing and the implications there, I'm going to take us through a few actual examples that we're seeing in the market and give our knowledge to all of you attendees on what's going on out in the market. All right, want to go ahead to the next slide, Nick? So we do have some learning objectives, of course, with this presentation. We're going to be providing as Rebecca said, a crash course on cost effectiveness testing and better understand which costs and benefits are considered for each test and how tariffs and incremental costs play a role in that test. How are these different tests responding to tariff changes? Where are the material costs coming into play and how is that all being recorded? Again, Rebecca's going to go over all of that as well. And then also considerations and scenarios that are going to help guide decision making. We want to provide you with the best information we can to help you make the best informed decisions that you can as relates to your programs. And then lastly, we'll be going over some of the potential impact we're seeing on retail programs and some strategies and changes that we're already seeing being implemented in the market. Go on to the next slide, Nick. All right, so it's been quite the roller coaster ride we've been on of late as it relates to tariffs. I think we were all a bit dizzy trying to think about and understand all the changes that have occurred over the last several months. It's been a lot of pauses, new tariffs, new negotiations that have occurred, and we're doing our best here at CLEAResult to track and monitor all those changes, but certainly want to recognize how how much of a roller coaster ride it has been the last few months, trying to keep track of everything that's going on with different countries and different products being tariffed at different levels. And so we're going to do our best here to kind of break that down for everybody and show you what we're seeing and how it's impacting utility programs. So here's a little chart that we've put together that's trying to track some of the tariff movements that we've seen. On the left-hand side, you'll see the country. On the right, just right of that, you'll see the tariff that they are charging to the U.S. for any products we're shipping in to their countries. And then in the subsequent columns, you're going to see all the different tariff changes on a percent basis that have occurred, going back to when this all started in April. So as you can see, some tariffs on some countries changed in the same day. Early in April, China woke up one day to 125% tariff, and then later in the afternoon, it was 145%. And then just a month later, it got brought all the way down to 30%. So that's just one example of this complete roller coaster ride we've been on, all the way up until this week alone. The European Union, we just announced another trade agreement there. We're a 15% tariff there. Japan last week had a trade deal announced there with 15% tariffs. So what we're essentially seeing a lot is, initially people in the market tried to react to the tariffs that were announced. Then with all the changes and uncertainty that came about, everyone just kind of took a pause and say, okay, now we're going to take a wait and see approach for how we're going to react to tariffs because it's just too difficult to try to keep up with and adjust our business operations based on this level of uncertainty. So we are starting to get some more certainty in the market. Again, not a lot, but some more firm trade agreements are being put into place, which is giving some of our partners in the market the ability to react and adjust to them accordingly. Okay, so with that, I will hand it over to Rebecca, who's going to start our crash course here on cost effectiveness.
Great. Thanks, Dan. So objective today, crash course, reminder, what are our cost effectiveness tests, what goes into them, hopefully just provide some directional insight on how we can all be thinking about how these tariffs might impact our programs. As Dan illustrated, we don't know exactly what's going to happen, right? We keep saying it's kind of if, when, how tariffs are going to impact our programs. How should we be thinking about it? What are things we can do to prepare? How can we understand, what the risks are of tariffs with our cost effectiveness testing? So let's start first with the big picture. We're talking about cost effectiveness, the 20,000 foot level. What we're talking about is the benefit cost ratio, right? We want to make sure that our offerings, when I say offerings, I mean that could be at a measure level, program level, portfolio level, whatever it is that we're offering. We want to make sure that those benefits always outweigh the cost of the offering, right? So if you have a benefit cost ratio in any of your cost effectiveness tests, which we're going to talk about next, that means that your offering is cost effective, right? Your benefits are outweighing those costs. If you get a test result that equals 1, that means you've broken even. And sometimes that's not a bad thing, right? We sometimes aim for 1. Maybe you have a new offering to your market that's going to take some time to get moving. And in the case where maybe you're below 1, that means that currently that offering is not cost effective, but just means we've got to do a little bit more noodling to get it there. So in terms of the standard cost effectiveness test that we look at, if we jump to the next slide, we'll do a brief overview of what those 5 tests are. So probably the one most are familiar with is the total resource cost test. That's looking at I'm going to go through just high level and what the perspective is of each of these tests, because there's different inputs and different considerations taken into each test. So your total resource cost test is just looking at things from the perspective of both the participant and the utility. Is this beneficial to everybody? Your program administrator cost test or utility cost test is the same test, 2 different names, just depends on maybe where you cut your teeth. In the industry, I will probably refer to it as the UCT throughout the rest of this conversation today. But this is just looking at the perspective from the utility, right? Does this make sense for us and for our business? The participant cost test, kind of self-explanatory there, is just making sure, does this benefit the customer, right? They're having to make some investment in this as well in terms of, paying that additional cost for a more high efficient opportunity. Does that pay off for them over time? The ratepayer impact measure, also known as the RIM test, is looking at the perspective of all customers, participants and non-participants, just to make sure does this have an impact on utility rates. And then the 5th cost test is the societal cost test, another one that kind of explains what it is in its name. But this is looking at things even beyond just the energy impacts. It can take into account things that are a little harder to measure. So think about things that impact society or our environment. That could be emissions reduction, that could be health improvements, it could be comfort. Things that are hard to quantify, but there are ways to do it. So those are the 5 standard cost tests that we commonly see across the industry. And these are at the high level today, but there might be some uniqueness to how those tests are scored in your local service territories. So if we jump to the next slide, also wanted to just kind of share how are these tests currently used across the U.S. So a couple quick things to point out is you'll notice that all 5 cost tests are used in numerous states. Where you see a bold state abbreviation just indicates that that is a primary cost test that might be the focus of the utility. It might be required from a regulatory perspective that those cost tests have to be passed. The thing that I want to point out here is if you look at line 2, the utility cost test, and line 4, the total resource cost test, you'll notice that both of those lines have 3 lines of states. So those are probably the cost tests that are used the most. But I say that even if maybe you are in a state or a jurisdiction where your total resource cost test is your primary test and it's what you're required to pass to offer a program. It is not uncommon to see a lot of other utilities will still screen based on these cost tests. So for example, maybe you have a great TRC score. but you look at it and realize our participant cost score is below 1. Maybe this really isn't a great offering for our customer. Should we go back to the drawing board and rethink how we're offering this? So just sharing that from the perspective of we've got all these tests, some are mandatory, but some are also great screeners and scales for the other benefits and impacts that your programs have. If we jump now to the next slide, a little bit of an eye chart on the next one, but I want to talk a little bit about, again, crash course, what are the different benefits and costs that each cost test looks at, right? So you'll see there across the top, we've got total resource cost test, utility cost test, participant cost test, RIM test, and your societal cost test. And if you look beneath those, it identifies what's considered a benefit and what's considered a cost in each one of those tests. I'm going to just run down the left column there really quickly to just talk through each of those items. So, the biggest benefit to your programs is always looking at what were the avoided energy and demand costs that were offset by offering this program, right? Some additional benefits might be some additional resource savings. So maybe you have a program that offers water widgets and there's water savings that can be considered. Maybe you're a gas utility and you offer measures that have gas savings, but maybe also electric savings that can be captured as a benefit. This one is a little mixed on whether you can include additional resources or not, depending on what you are or where you are. Also on there is another benefit related to those non-energy benefits that we mentioned in relation to the societal cost test, right? That's looking at how else is society benefiting from these programs. You can also see that on occasion, if you've heard the term modified TRC, MTRC, there are some places that are allowing these additional energy benefits to be accounted for in your TRC. Starting to move into some of the cost side of it, right? Your incremental equipment and installation cost is a cost that has to be overcome in 2 of the 5 cost tests. And we're going to talk about this one a little bit more in detail in a minute. But when we talk about incremental cost, it's the difference of, hey, our efficient option costs $1,500, our baseline option costs $1,000. It's the difference between the two. It's that $500. The $500 of cost to move to that more efficient option is what we're talking about for that line item. Additionally, some costs that might be considered are on the utility side, right? What are the costs for equipment, operation, and maintenance that maybe have to be considered as costs for your benefit cost ratio? Also on here, identified obviously as a cost is what does it cost to implement your programs? What does it cost to implement them, market them, and get them out and available to your customers? Next line down, incentive is actually separate. It's not covered in your program overhead costs. And that actually is an interesting one. It can be seen both as a cost and a benefit, right? So it's seen as a cost from the utility cost test and from our RIM test. But for your participants, it's a benefit, right? That is an incentive that they are receiving to help them, close in on that void of that incremental cost, to bring that cost down for them, to make it more viable for them to choose that more energy efficient option. Applicable tax credits may or may not be something that gets considered in your cost test. Again, kind of depends on where you are. And then the last slide item there is your customer bill savings and also your reduced utility revenue. So both a benefit and a cost, depending on which cost test you're looking at. So crash course, went through that very quickly. You will have this cheat sheet available to you after the training today, so you can grab this for your own reference. But now what we want to do, now that we've crash coursed through our cost effectiveness test, is just understand, hone in a little bit more to say, okay, when tariffs come into play, where do they hit in these cost tests, and what are the impacts that they potentially have on your cost test results? So if we jump to the next slide, you'll see kind of that same chart. And what I want to talk about today are going to be kind of 2 focus areas for today, at least, is the incremental cost, right? So if material costs go up, it's more than likely that the incremental cost is also going to increase. That variance, because these tariffs are not just on the efficient case, it's also on the baseline case. So we have to understand how might that impact total resource cost test and your participant cost test. We're also going to talk about incentives, and this one, when we get to it, we'll get into a little bit more details. But if you are, for example, where we're seeing this one pop up more, is if you have programs that offer a fully covered cost of something to your customers. Maybe you offer a kit program, for example, where you cover the full cost of a kit going to a customer. The full cost of that kit is actually calculated as the incentive to the customer. So there are some scenarios in which we have to look at the incentive and understand how that might be impacted, if, when, how tariffs come into play over time. So let's jump to the next slide and talk about incremental cost, right? So incremental cost, again, that variance, that difference between your high efficient and your baseline equipment, again, is going to be primarily focused on your total resource cost test and your participant cost test. And one thing I had listed here, because this is something that's thrown myself and some of my team through a loop the last few months, again, going back to Dan's kind of roller coaster, originally we were like, oh, it's just going to be, it's going to increase incremental cost across the board. And then we realized, if you go back to the chart later, depending on where equipment is manufactured, there are scenarios that we came up with that were like, oh gosh, if the baseline equipment is typically most commonly produced in this country and the efficient equipment is most commonly produced in this country with different tariffs, it kind of opened up some things of like, oh, we could have, most scenarios will increase, but we could have some where maybe it's not impacted at all, or maybe could we have a weird scenario where it decreases. So just sharing that, because that's something we're having to constantly kind of monitor and think about, but just an interesting snippet to share. But we're going to, in just a minute, we're going to go through, I learned by example, so I put together a very simple, hypothetical, conceptual run through of a cost test and what might happen. But some things to hone on before we jump into that is just remember is, our customers, if when how tariffs come into play, they're going to experience a real cost increase no matter what choice they're making on their equipment purchases. I think the concern, and the thing that keeps me up at night, and I'm sure many of us, is how is that going to impact project throughput, right? If your cost is increasing, and it's already hard sometimes to get participants to make that leap to the more efficient cost, with uncertainty in the economy, increased cost, how do we make sure that customers continue to feel confident in making that more energy efficient opportunity? And so what I wanted to wait on this for a minute is to make one really important point here. As mentioned, the total resource cost test is probably one of the top tests we see used across the country. And what I want to note here is if you look, you note that the incentive payment is not considered part of your total resource cost test. So if you have the opportunity, if when how tariffs come into play, to revisit your incentives and you have it within your budget, that is one lever you have to pull, is to say, hey, as if these costs do increase, we have some capacity to increase our incentives and still pass our cost effectiveness by creating additional incentive to get our customers to keep moving and making those energy efficient decisions. So now let's kind of hop into a hypothetical, completely made up scenario, but just because again, I'm a conceptual learner, needed to kind of run through the math, and we probably have, I don't know, probably 15 spreadsheets of 1,000 different scenarios we've been looking at. But let's just pretend for a minute. You have a program and you have a smart thermostat rebate that you offer to your customers. How could a tariff impact, or how could tariffs impact that cost test for your team? So again, when we're talking about incremental cost, it's seen as a cost for your total resource cost test and your participant cost test. In these tables to the side where I've got some results of TRC and participant cost test, I just used some kind of quick rule of thumb, simple payback calculations, kept everything the same. The only thing that I adjusted was what that incremental cost might look like. So, in our pre-tariff scenario, we're looking at the difference between our baseline and our efficient case. That incremental cost is about $100 right now. If you know, at the beginning when Dan kicked off, he said, hey, we do know, well, for example, thermostats, a lot of them are being sourced from China. If that 30% tariff comes into play, and we make another pretty broad assumption that that tariff will be passed down linearly, right, we would see our incremental costs go from $100 to $130. So if we hop over to the tables here to the right and look at it, nothing has changed, right? I've changed no other inputs in these simple paybacks, but just by simply seeing that increased cost in the material cost and the incremental cost for this smart thermostat example, we see that the TRC decreases by 11% in this scenario, and the participant cost decreases by 23%. Because don't forget, for the participant, that incremental cost is a big piece, and what incentive is being offered is a big piece. So I didn't change the incentive, right? So if you just increase the cost, it's going to cause a bigger decrease in your cost test there. So these are hypothetical. Obviously, every single one of you on the call are going to be subject to your own local, avoided cost, regulatory requirements. But for purposes of today, just trying to demonstrate, how these incremental costs can be impacted with material costs. So next, I wanted to talk a little bit about, I mentioned, incentives are another place that might be impacted by increases in tariffs, right? So, where we have, it's on the wrong one. The box should be up one. So we're talking about incentive payments, right? So for our incentives, you have your utility cost test, your participant cost test, and your RIM test all take your incentive payment as either a cost or a benefit. One thing to point out here that's really interesting is in this case where we're saying, hey, you're capturing the full cost of something for your customers. Examples that we listed there, maybe you have a direct install program where you 100% cover the cost of equipment installed. Maybe we mentioned, a kit program, maybe you have a food distribution program or food bank distribution program. The cost of that material that you're covering 100% is considered an incentive, right? So if we see that those costs increase, you've got to factor that in, right, to your cost effectiveness test. So again, the interesting thing, if you should choose to continue to cover those costs in full, your participant cost test actually increases. So let's jump to our hypothetical scenario again on the next slide. So in this case, I'm still using a smart thermostat. We're going to keep it simple. But in this case, it's a giveaway program. Instead of it being a rebate program, you're providing at 100% fully funded a smart thermostat to your customer. And 3 cost tests we're looking at here: utility cost test, RIM test, and participant cost test. Same scenario, your baseline, your pre-tariff cost for that smart thermostat was $130. If that 30% tariff comes into play, it's passed down linearly, your cost goes up to $169 to offer that, right? So again, keeping all other inputs the same and only changing, in this case, the incentive for these 3 cost tests, you could see that your utility cost test in this scenario goes down by 9%, your participant cost test goes up by 18%, right? Because you're continuing in the scenario to cover that full cost for your customer, and your RIM test could go down by 7%. So a lot of different scenarios you can play through. Maybe this is a little simplified for today, but just to kind of give that conceptual thought of like, okay, where are material costs really, where do they really hit in each cost test? What are different scenarios I have to be thinking about and playing through? So just to kind of hit a couple high points, and I'll hand it over to Dan, who can share just things that he's seeing, his team is experiencing real life. It's just reminders on some things you all face. If when how tariffs come into play, we're all going to see an increase in cost no matter what option you're choosing, baseline or efficient. It's really important that as we continue to monitor the roller coaster that Dan shared at the beginning, we just need to really understand what cost tests are required for our programs and what levers do we have to pull, right? So on those levers, one of the big things is going to be, how can we dig in on incentives, right? How can we help the customers cover that void of these increasing material costs if, when, how tariffs come into play? But how do we visit, what are the measures that really give you the best bang for your buck? Is there some wiggle room to increase that incentive, still remain cost effective, and still support your customers in making that more energy efficient choice? Other things we're thinking about as well is looking at your measure offerings. Do you have measures that maybe are low, have low capital costs, where there's not a lot of material requirements? Think about things like tune-ups. Can we help keep equipment running as efficiently as possible while maybe people delay capital investment? Do you have behavioral programs that maybe don't have a ton of capital but have a capital cost, but have ways to maybe move forward in different ways? So there's some different things to be thinking about there. And then Dan's going to talk about this in a minute, but things we need to continue to do as well is just keep working with our trades, distributors, manufacturers. They're going to have the most lifetime feedback for us on how things are moving and changing. And that's going to be an important channel for us to stay connected to. And then obviously, we looked through these, we've been looking at this for a long time. And the good news is, a few months ago, some of these cost tests were looking much scarier than the scenarios we worked through today. But it's going to be a constant and continued kind of monitoring process on how this all comes into play. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dan. He can share some things that he's seeing in real life.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. Go on to the next slide. So one thing we do want to acknowledge is, the tariff situation is still very much fluid. Things are changing rapidly in the market. Our retailers and manufacturing partners have committed to keeping us as informed as they can on these impactful changes, but noting that sometimes the changes can occur so quickly that they're not able to properly, communicate to us what their strategy is moving forward to account for those changes. But some of what we do know in the market is, back in May, a number of the large national retailers on their earnings calls directly addressed tariffs and their strategy for, dealing with them. So the first one to announce was Walmart, and they came out and announced that they are planning to increase their prices due to tariffs. Despite the Trump administration coming back a few days later, they doubled down on that decision as well. And so they are planning to increase price and pass along those increased costs to the consumers. A few of the other retailers that are out there, Home Depot and Lowe's, announced that week as well. And back in May, Home Depot announced that they are not going to increase their prices directly due to tariffs. That may have had, that announcement may have had something to do with the reaction to Walmart's announcement a few days earlier. But they did make the decision to not publicly increase incentives due to tariffs. And then a day later, Lowe's more or less, skirted the topic on their earnings call. They didn't provide a direct stance one way or the other. But some of the things that we've been hearing behind the scenes that haven't necessarily been promoted more publicly are, we can expect to see changes in stocking. All of our retail partners have said we are likely going to be looking at changing the variety of the products that we stock and the quantity of the products that we stock. And all of that is more of a direct impact that's not necessarily price related to tariffs, but it is due to tariffs in one way they're managing them. Due to that, we could expect to see some slower sales if they're not carrying as many products in store, or if they're carrying a smaller variety of products. It may have an impact on sales, and so that's something we'll be monitoring as well. And lastly, just want to reiterate, no retailer is going to have a standard approach to addressing tariffs. Each retailer, each merchant, for each product category is going to have the autonomy to make their own decisions and address tariffs the way they want to. We have seen some retailers say we can no longer incentivize certain measures. They're trying to slow down sales so that they don't have to purchase as often and encounter these higher costs due to tariffs. That's one approach one merchant is taking on a select number of products. But that's not the approach everyone's going to take. So it's important to be flexible and just understand that there will be different approaches at different retailers on different products. Next slide. So what some of the things that you should be doing, of course, it's always a good idea to be listening to these retailers' earnings calls. You can pick up a lot of good information on them and understand what their strategy is moving forward. But in short, you should be monitoring pricing, inventory, and stocking at any retailers you're working with. Also look at what's being impacted more, inefficient or efficient models. As Rebecca noted, depending on where products and components of these products are manufactured, tariffs can impact the efficient model and the inefficient model differently. And so are we seeing increases in the incremental costs, decreases in the incremental costs, or are they staying about the same? You'll also want to make sure that the percentage of the products being stocked on the stores and isn't such that there are more inefficient products than efficient products being stocked. While this doesn't directly impact cost effectiveness, it kind of impacts evaluations and understanding, what the market share of the available products is versus, your efficient product versus your inefficient product. And we'll get into a few examples of this in the future slides. And then next, coordinating with your product manufacturers, understanding where the products and components are being sourced from. This will help you know which products and which partnerships you're currently working with are most exposed to tariffs and could see the highest potential impact there. And then next, of course, understand what types of steps the manufacturers are taking to mitigate these impacts. Are they looking to move their manufacturing? Are they looking to source different components from different countries? One of the things we'll get into is the use of bonded warehouses. It's something that I didn't know a lot about until this tariff conversation occurred, but a lot of manufacturers are using bonded warehouses as a way to provide them with flexibility as it relates to the changing environment with tariffs. Next slide. So one example that we've seen with a product that has seen a price increase in the market is heat pump water heaters. So the efficient product, which is the heat pump product, saw an increase of about $150 across the board. And this happened relatively early in the April-May timeframe due to the fact that these products are primarily manufactured in Mexico, and these products included a significant amount of steel in their production. And so steel tariffs were a hot topic at the beginning, as well as tariffs on products coming from Mexico. One difference we saw is the electric resistance water heater, while it also saw a price increase, that increase was only by about $50. And so this creates another $100 incremental cost difference between the inefficient and efficient product, which we have seen some programs take advantage of and take it as an opportunity to increase their incentive on that product and try to transform that market more quickly. Next, we'll talk about a few of the strategies we've seen manufacturers take. So we have, as I mentioned before, manufacturers are using bonded warehouses. Quick little summary on what those are. Basically, manufacturers can ship product into the US, put them in a bonded warehouse, and then they don't have to pay a tariff on that product until it is released from that warehouse. And the product can stay in the warehouse up to 5 years. So it gives manufacturers quite a bit of flexibility as to when they want to release products from those warehouses and actually put them into the market. When you have tariffs changing as quickly as they are now, that product may hit the warehouse, with the example of China at 145% tariff, they hold it into that bonded warehouse and then they release it when that tariff is reduced to 30%. So provides the manufacturers with quite a bit of flexibility. We have some manufacturers that have talked about shifting where they're producing products from different countries. This was certainly very much early on in the tariff discussions. Everyone was trying to take that reactionary approach and say, well, I've got to move my manufacturing to a different country. Now folks are kind of taking a wait and see approach because some of the countries they were planning to move their manufacturing to actually have higher tariffs now than the countries that originally were products were originally being manufactured. So I think everyone's taking a kind of a wait and see approach before they make any drastic changes, such as where they're moving their manufacturing, but something certainly that's being considered. But ultimately, when it comes to manufacturers, flexibility is what's key. Due to the uncertainty and the changes in the market, having a strategy that's flexible and doesn't tie them into one strategy versus another is key. And then lastly, we want to talk about product availability. And one product that's been hit quite a bit this year is Energy Star room ACs. So retailers are carrying a much more limited quantity of Energy Star room ACs than they have historically. This could be due to there was a major recall that was announced in June, and we are seeing that the products that are replacing the Energy Star models are non-Energy Star models, and so the retailers are reverting back to inefficient products rather than replacing them with other Energy Star certified models. Next slide. All right, so just to kind of recap what we've covered today, again, we went through the 5 primary utility cost tests and determined that are used to determine cost effectiveness to better understand where the costs and where the incremental costs are hitting with each test. As Rebecca outlined in different examples, depending on the test, it can have a different impact. Tariffs can have a different impact on the results of those tests. Also going through considerations and scenarios. Again, we want to make sure we're providing you with information that is guiding your decision making in the face of this uncertainty that we're seeing. As I just went through, here are some real life examples of what we're seeing in the market, strategies both retailers and manufacturers are taking to adjust to tariffs. And then of course, there's just the uncertainty of what's to happen in the future. All right, so with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Nick for any questions we may have.
All right, everyone. As you have questions, type them into the question box and we'll answer them here. Our first question is, can you talk about the impacts to commercial programs and smaller businesses?
Sure, I'll touch on that a little bit here. So certainly, as you're working with more local trades, some local distributors that aren't on a national basis, they may not have the ability or the visibility to adjust as quickly as some of these national retailers are, right? And so I think you can expect to see more reactionary adjustments at the more local level with some of these smaller retailers or distributors or trade allies that we're working with. They may not have the ability to project out into the future and make those types of forward-looking decisions. So they'll likely be more reactionary and just say, well, my cost went up by this amount, and so now I'm just going to pass that cost off to customers.
All right. Next question. Could you elaborate on how these tariff impacts might affect evaluation?
Sure, I can try to tackle that one. We don't know yet, right? As these are coming, evaluations usually happening on the back end of a program offering, and these some of these impacts are still coming around, still being introduced, are still unknowns, are still moving. So I think that's something we're going to have to continue to look at, work with evaluators on, and understand what are they seeing and hearing. Is it similar to what we're seeing and hearing? So just another channel of communication to keep open as we continue kind of down this tariff journey.
All right. Was a specific cost benefit tool used to evaluate the tariff impacts?
Yes, I have a couple of tools that we have developed kind of in-house that we use to look at the calcs today were a little bit more of a simple payback, but we have a much more detailed tool that we use when we're analyzing cost effectiveness of programs that takes into account a lot of things that we didn't cover today. So things like discount rates, your weighted average cost of capital, leakage rates, line losses, net to gross ratios. We have kind of a tool that we use that does kind of a full utility planning level analysis where we can look at cost effectiveness at the measure level, the program level, the portfolio level. So I did kind of reference some of that in trying to come up with the scenarios today. But it is an in-house tool. There are some tools probably on the market that you can use directly as well.
All right. Okay. Well, I'm not seeing too many other questions come in. So if you do have more questions, if more questions come up where you want to contact presenters, Rebecca and Dan, they have their emails here on this slide. And, so feel free to reach out and we can answer any questions, comments you may have. Okay, we got another question come in. Do manufacturers see a future where their products are unaffordable?
It's a great question. I think as we've seen recently, as there's been tariffs, as there's just been normal inflation, inflationary impacts on the market as well, you'll certainly get to a breaking point where a consumer is only going to be willing to pay a certain amount of money for a product. So I think there is a delicate balance there between, what the market is willing to bear and what the manufacturer needs to sell the product for in order to turn a profit. I think right now we haven't quite hit that. I think manufacturers are looking for other ways, they're looking for utility funds and incentives to help maybe offset some of those higher costs, so it's not as much of an impact on the consumer as well. But there is potentially that risk where some products, may be deemed unaffordable, and at that point, it's going to be on the manufacturer to say, what can I do to decrease my cost to then make that product more affordable? I don't think, as long as there's still a market for that product and the consumers are trying to buy it, I don't think they would stop manufacturing it. I think that would be then on the manufacturer to say, how can I reduce my costs?
All right. Do you see tariffs affecting the cost of energy?
Great question. Been thinking about this a lot. I see Dan smiling too because we think about this an awful lot. I would anticipate the answer to that is yes, right? Because a lot of, from a utility perspective, a lot of your infrastructure, the equipment that you use to manage your infrastructure might be increasing in cost, right? How much does it cost to replace a transformer now as compared to pre-tariff or a year ago? Other things we think about too are the need to produce on the electric side more generation, whereas a lot of that equipment manufactured. So depending on how tariffs roll out, I would anticipate that the answer to that question is yes, and that's something that we're closely watching as well and trying to get feedback, from y'all on kind of what are you seeing and feeling and hearing as well that we need to be considering for future state. Dan, not sure if you want to add anything to that.
No, I would just say, as the cost of energy increases, it just makes these programs that much more important to help the consumer try to offset those costs.
It's a great question. I wish I had a crystal ball to answer that one.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Hope you learned something. Please reach out if you have more questions. And in the post-webinar survey, indicate if you'd like a copy of the deck or a continuing education certificate. Thank you so much for joining today. Have a great one. We'll see you next time.